Thanks very much, Duncan. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here today. It's such a professionally organized meeting. It's really a pleasure to be in this midst of this group and to be so well managed by such an excellent team, and I'm very pleased that we have such a good turnout. I have to say thanks to Harbinder for sort of launching into what I want to talk about, which I want to talk about data. And I want to make 3 points in this presentation, and where I'm going to end up is to describe to you some work that we have ongoing at the OECD, and we've done some work in collaboration with ODI on this, to try and develop a new measure that would capture the different kinds of external financial flows that are coming into developing countries, but it will be flows that are important from a partner country perspective. So it's quite different. We are coming from the OECD. We are doing work to try and upgrade the kind of statistics that we have access to from OECD statistical resources that could fit into this measure. But it's a very, very ambitious plan. It's why I've come here to try and describe this to you, because we have to try and help people understand maybe this is something that would be useful for the developing world. And if that is in fact the case, then we have to mobilize all kinds of effort, because we have a very scattered, dispersed, ungovernable international statistical financial system for development finance. So I have 3 points. The first one is talking a little bit about what is happening on the ground in developing countries. Do they know what resources are coming in and where those resources are going? More importantly, how are they coping with this new development finance landscape that's described in this publication and in so many other sources of information now, especially in the run-up to the Addis meeting? There are opportunities, a lot of opportunities with these new resources, particularly for countries who have good macroeconomic conditions and who can tap into international financial capital markets and who are attractive investment destinations for different kinds of private investment flows. But there are also risks, and Annalisa has mentioned the debt sustainability risk. There are others. How are partner countries managing the money? They need to do it in a smart way. I remember hearing several years ago Trevor Manuel say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And in fact, that is the case. It underscores why it is so important for everybody in the developing world and in the developed world to understand what's happening with financial resources, to track them, to measure them, to understand what they're being used for. There are 4 areas where this is very important. First, in terms of management. You need to understand if the money that you're receiving is going to where your priorities are. Is it going to where there's really the most needs? It's the countries that are most in need. Are they receiving the resources? Or, as Harbinder said, the poorest of the poor in those countries, are they receiving the resources that are needed? Are the resources cost effective? Are they too expensive? Are there risks involved with receiving them? Are they being used in a strategic way? Are countries understanding what's coming across their border and figuring out how to allocate those resources in the best way? There's also an accountability dimension to tracking resources. We have the well-known index for ODA, the 0.7% target. We also have a UN target for resources going to LDCs of 0.15% to 0.20%. These are important targets for the international community, and having the information about those kinds of resources is essential in order to ensure that we do have accountability in the international system. And finally, we need to know what's happening, where the resources are coming, and what they're being used for in order to ensure that we're making the best use of those resources, because they are scarce at the end of the day. We need to be aware of the risks that are involved, and we also need to find out, of the resources that we're receiving, how are we going to attract more of them? We've heard today information about massive pools of capital that are held by institutional investors, $83 trillion under management. Well, maybe there are some things that developing countries could do to attract that kind of resource. If they knew about that kind of resources, if they understood what was happening in other countries in terms of those other countries accessing that pool of capital, maybe they would be able to tap into it as well. They could find out what needs to be done in terms of the domestic policy environment that could attract that kind of resource. The same thing for blended finance. This is on the rise. The same thing for guarantees. Same thing for foreign direct investment. Now, the second point I'm going to talk about is the work that we did jointly with ODI. This is the case studies that we did, where we were mapping development finance from countries' perspectives. I was involved in one study that took place in East Timor. The results of these different case studies were interesting. First, the countries we found, of course, they welcomed the new diverse range of resources that they were accessing. But at the same time, they weren't really aware of the totality of the external finance that was crossing their borders. They didn't really know the total amount that was available to them, where it was going, where it was coming from. There was really no strategic plan in place on how they were going to finance their development. They weren't thinking about where are the sources of capital and what they could do to attract it. There's a weak demand for statistics, and there's also some capacity constraints that are very, very high for some developing countries. So these were the results that we came at when we conducted these case studies in developing countries. We will continue to do this to be able to have an even more informed understanding of what's happening with the development finance scenarios in developing countries themselves. And now I'll end up with giving you a little bit of information about this proposed new measure of development finance from a partner country perspective. We are currently scoping this measure. We are trying to consult with different people, with different countries, with different international experts. We had a workshop in Paris at the end of June. We'll continue to reach out to different people, different experts to find out what their views are on this new proposed measure. In the OECD, we are working to try and upgrade and to modernize the statistics that we do collect among OECD countries. So we are looking at the official side, so that's ODA, that's non-concessional loans, it's guarantees, it's equity flows, it's also export credits that are provided by OECD countries. And then on the private side, we do have statistics in the OECD on foreign direct investment, on bank flows, and on portfolio investments. So we are working with other services in the OECD, and we are working also within our creditor reporting system to try and upgrade, modernize, deepen, strengthen, and improve the integrity of the statistics that are collected for the purposes of being able to track and provide information to a potential new measure. We have a couple of issues that we've identified at this stage. First, to what extent, when we look at these new types of flows, would we consider it as being helpful for development, or to what extent really could they only be considered as commercial? Of course, this would be a factor in FDI. It would be also a factor in export credits. And we're also considering whether they should be counted at a gross or a net level. These are kind of technical issues. But we do have a big challenge, and that is that, as I said at the beginning, we have no general oversight, no governance of the international system for statistics on development finance. We have a large number of sources of information that are available. They all have different definitions, different measurement techniques. We did a big data search to try and find out in the public and the private sector, regional, international, multilateral, whatnot, what there was out there in terms of databases on different kinds of international financial flows. And it was just amazing. I mean, there were more than 250 massive sources of information, and there was really some very interesting information that we unearthed about private sector information from different consulting companies, Big 8, accounting firms, and investment banks and whatnot, who track this kind of thing. So there's all kinds of actors that are working in the statistical world, but there's no talk that's happening between them. There's no coordination. And that's where we're at with this particular idea. We need to mobilize people, we need to get the word out, and we need to try and strengthen the amount of coordination that's ongoing in the international system. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Raundi.